Hello and welcome to Digital Academy. I hope you're doing well and having a decent day. Let's check out Plato in the Cave. Okay, Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So remember, an allegory is a story that is about the thing, but also about something else. Right? So it is a story about these people in a cave, but it's also a story that helps explain something else. Just like the book Animal Farm is a story about animals on a farm, but it's also a story that if you understand that, and then you say, well, okay, well, this character kind of represents this character, and this one represents this one, you can see that Animal Farm is actually an allegory to help understand the Russian Revolution. So, an allegory is a story that's often a simpler story that you use almost as a learning tool to explain a deeper concept. And Plato's doing this here with this idea of the cave. Man, I'm doing a lot of these TED Eds lately. Digital Academy.
What is reality? Knowledge? The meaning of life? Big topics you might tackle figuratively, explaining existence as a journey down a road or across an ocean, a climb, a war, a book, a thread, a game, a window of opportunity, or an all too short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out.
Yeah.
In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to keep in mind, that Plato's making this point after his teacher and mentor and friend, dear friend, was, at some point I'll maybe do a more long thing on the trial of Socrates, but basically, put to death for truth, right? For not bowing to the emperor, for not, well, the trial of Socrates. I'll do a whole thing on it, but he was basically killed by the state. So Plato saying that there's danger inherent in seeking truth when his truth-seeking mentor was just killed has some additional weight, right?
And his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher king.
So this is the thing, right? So this is kind of a confusing idea, because when you think of maybe ancient Greece, two common things to think of is the democracy idea and the philosophy idea. And then this is saying like actually Socrates and Plato at times were highly critical of democracy, and in its purest idea, what is democracy? This idea of group rule, but in its worst, it's mob rule, right? This idea of like whatever everyone wants, they do. And Plato said, well, maybe a better idea would be to pick people that, that are almost representatives, or what he called philosopher kings, and have them make the decisions. And this is kind of where, at a certain level, we get the words Republican, Democrat, although I'm not trying to make any claim that those current political parties are like what Plato was talking about, but at least that's where they're pulling the names from. So this is interesting, right? So he's saying that's where you may have heard the term philosopher king before, right? So Plato was saying like it's not necessarily the political systems that are inherently the problem. It's like it's corruption, right? And if there's corruption, then almost no political system is going to work. But if you could eliminate that, and if you could actually have philosopher kings, and if we could actually reward people for being good people, not for some of the more shallow things that are so current in our current society, that if we could actually, his thing is like when kings are philosophers and philosophers are kings, then we'll be moving in the right direction.
With the cave parable, Plato may be arguing that the masses are too stubborn and ignorant to govern themselves. But the allegory has captured imaginations for 2,400 years because it can be read in far more ways.
So just think about how crazy it is that we're even talking about a story that somebody wrote down 2,500 years ago. That's crazy. Like how just the huge influence of Greek philosophy is so interesting.
Importantly, the allegory is connected to the theory of forms developed in Plato's other dialogues, which holds that, like the shadows on the wall, things in the physical world are flawed reflections of ideal forms, such as roundness or beauty. In this way, the cave leads to many fundamental questions, including the origin of knowledge, the problem of representation, and the nature of reality itself. For theologians, the ideal forms exist in the mind of a creator. For philosophers of language viewing the forms as linguistic concepts, the theory illustrates the problem of grouping concrete things under abstract terms. And others still wonder whether we can really know that the things outside the cave are any more real than the shadows. As we go about our lives,
an interesting way of looking at that would be like in our modern digital world, right, where sometimes online realities become for some people almost favorable to in-person realities. It's weird to say like online world and real world, because obviously the online world is still the real world, but you could say like, everyone knows what you mean when you say that, so it's useful to say even if it's whatever. You guys know what I'm saying. I don't need to explain that.
Be confident in what we think we know. Perhaps one day a glimmer of light may punch a hole in your most basic assumptions. Will you break free to struggle towards the light, even if it costs you your friends and family? Or stick with comfortable and familiar illusions? Truth or habit? Light or shadow? Hard choices. But if it's any consolation, you're not alone. There are lots of us down here.
That's something to think about. Plato, man, never ceases to make you think. But that's a classic allegory. Maybe I'll get into some more allegories. I find allegories super cool. This idea of having a story that's an interesting story that's kind of deliberately designed to be kind of interesting, but also a model to build a more complicated idea. Yeah, it's like a learning tool. It's really neat. All right, I hope you like that, and I hope you do your best to have the best kind of day you can, and be helpful to the people around you, and try to stay positive and plan for whatever. Just have a good day. Take care. Cheers.